Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third chapter of the North South Feminist Dialogue series. Uh, and sorry, we started a couple of minutes late because we were dealing with very little technical issue, which has now been resolved. So thank you for waiting patiently. Our theme this year is silencing sexual misconduct in academia, the politics of naming, and the cost of speaking out. This year, we will have two panels. The second one is on the 11th of March, where we continue the conversation that we start today. So please sign up if you haven't. We will drop a link in the chat in case you don't have the link. I'm Audrija, the principal investigator of a UKRI-funded research project called Fem Ideas, Decolonizing Sexual and Gender-Based Violence in Higher Education, based at the University of Westminster. The project aims to develop survivor-centered, intersectional, decolonial, and abolitionist theories and approaches to prevent and better respond to sexual and gender-based violence in our universities. Our research brings together insights, experiences from survivors, activists, academics, and policymakers from South Africa, Nigeria, Brazil, and Argentina. Dr. Jess Wild is my co-investigator on our project, and I'm also the co-director of the 1752 group, along with my colleagues, Dr. Anna Bull and Dr. Tiffany Page. When I started the North South Feminist Dialogue series about 5 years ago, I did not think it would become a recurring event. So I want to start by thanking everyone who has supported and nurtured this project. We started in 2020 with the aim of developing and creating an equal and safer space for survivors, academics, activists, and organizers could come together across borders and learn from each other. It's a platform for transnational knowledge exchange and solidarity. The need from this platform emerged from the realization and the frustration that much of the academic research on the issue of sexual and gender-based violence in higher education problematically was focused on the global north, with little to no knowledge exchange between the global north and the south. However, our activism and work showed that some amazing and radical work and conversations around this was happening in the global south. So we felt that it was time to disrupt some of these imperial geographies of knowledge production by bringing focus to the global south and attempting to decolonize the discourse. So it's important to mention here that we understand decolonizing as not only reading to Black and brown scholars from the global south and claim that we have decolonized, as many marketized universities do, but rather we follow Black feminist thoughts and indigenous scholars, and we understand decolonization as recentering, restructuring, redistributing, and reimagining. Since we started, we've met every 2 years to collectively discuss an emerging issue, questions that many of us have been thinking about or struggling with in the area of sexual and gender-based violence in higher education globally. However, while we do these thematic workshops and panels every 2 years, some of us are attempting to keep the conversation going. We keep collaborating with each other throughout the year. Working on this issue is difficult, exhausting, and isolating. So our aim is also to create a community of people who can learn from each other and support one another. So we don't do this work alone. So if you want to get in touch with us, please follow us on Twitter. We are @fem_ideas or @1752 group. Write to us, get in touch. We're always happy to have a chat. Also, every chapter of the North South Feminist Dialogue that we do results in a report with summaries of our conversations, key findings, and recommendations where appropriate. Our 2 previous reports are available on the resources section of the 1752 group website. We will also put both the links on the chat for you to access if you haven't had a chance to look at them. This brings me to the 1752 group. The 1752 Group is a research and campaigning organization based in the UK. I've had the privilege of working alongside my co-directors, Anna and Tiffany, from the very beginning of the North-South Feminist Dialogue series. The two panels this year have also been co-organized and co-designed by the 1752 Group. This webinar will be recorded, but unfortunately we have decided not to make it publicly available. And the recordings, we will only access the recordings to take notes or revisit some of the points that our speakers bring up today while we put together the report for this year. A Safer Spaces document was also sent to every single person who signed up. I hope you've all had a chance to engage with it. This is to ensure that our event is an inclusive, welcoming, and affirming space for everyone who attends. The document also includes link to support resources and information. We want to take this opportunity to also very quickly thank our funders, the University of Westminster and SOAS, for supporting this project. Now I want to come back to our panel today. Today is Rosa Luxemburg's birthday. So I thought it would be fitting to start with something that she said. The most revolutionary thing one can do is always proclaim loudly what is happening. In the wake of movements like Me Too, RU Reference List, Ni Una Menos, students, staff, activists across the world courageously spoke out and named their perpetrators and shared stories of sexual and gender-based violence in higher education institutions globally. Revealing deep-seated patterns of abuse of power and privilege. However, despite empowering calls to speak out and break the silence, we realize that survivors, staff, activists, students, more often than not, are facing severe backlash from both institutions and perpetrators. Recent cases have raised significant concerns in the academic community, highlighting survivors' challenges in disclosing their experiences even when anonymizing their accounts. This is something that we will discuss at length in our second workshop. But this also reflects a broader problem prevalent in academia of silencing survivors through libel law. Many survivors mention that naming perpetrators and speaking about their experience is an important aspect of both individual and community healing and accountability, but it is increasingly difficult to do so without severe consequences. At the same time, there are also growing calls for institutionally handed lists of names of perpetrators of sexual violence in universities. Such lists have a history of carcerality and are used to target people belonging to the most marginalized in our communities. So we want to use this space and the panel today to explore the politics of naming perpetrators and the consequences. And we are delighted to have our amazing panelists, who I will introduce to you in a second. We will conduct this panel as a discussion where I have a list of questions for our amazing speakers. This panel is conducted in a webinar format, so the audience cannot interact with the speakers directly, but we do have the Q&A section. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section, and we will pick it up. Depending on how we go, we can take a 2-minute breather at the midway point to give our speakers a little break as well, and for you to collect your thought. Our first speaker was meant to be a journalist and filmmaker, Kiki Mordi, but unfortunately, she's not been able to join us at the moment, but we are hoping that Kiki can join us very soon. But I will move on to our second speaker for now, who is Joel Quirk. Joel is a professor of politics at the University of Witwatersrand. Sorry, I can't pronounce that, or WITS, as we say in short. His research focuses on enslavement and abolition, work and mobility, gender and violence, historical repair, and the history of politics of Africa. Joel's most recent co-edited work is titled Research as More Than Extraction, Knowledge Production, and Gender-Based Violence in African Society. Joel has also been involved in various communities formed to address sexual violence at WITS And recently, alongside a colleague, wrote an article titled Sexual Harassers Should Be Named by Universities. The article is actually available on our Twitter. So if you want to read the whole article, you can find the link there. But this article was written in response to the sudden resignation of Vice Chancellor Professor Tawana Coupe from the University of Pretoria. And it was later uncovered that the resignation was bound up in complications associated with an independent probe into allegations of sexual harassment. It was also uncovered that Coupe had upheld findings of sexual harassment when he was previously employed at WITS and was issued a final warning, but that was completely covered up. Joel, thank you so much for joining us today and participating in this discussion. So I want to start off by asking you, what led you to write this article? And why do you think, based on your work, that it is important to name perpetrators who have upheld findings?
Yeah, thanks, Adrija. I really appreciate the invitation to join this conversation, because I think that it's something that is talked about kind of indirectly a lot of the time, rather than made a primary focal point for conversation. So if you'll kind of forgive me, I just want to give a little bit of the institutional backstory behind my kind of the article you referenced, and just to give you a bit of the context regarding how things played out at my kind of university in Johannesburg. So about 12 years ago, as a new member of staff here at WITS, there was a news article in a student paper, Vuvuzela, which named anonymously a professor who was subsequently revealed to my then head of department. So my immediate line manager was named in this newspaper. And this article, following a lot of student protests and a lot of kind of mobilization on campus, ultimately ended up in kind of front page kind of national news in South Africa on the Sunday Times. And there was this kind of fight alarm fire, at least for university management, around the idea that Wits University was a haven for what was then described as sex pests. Now, sex pest isn't a great term. It's kind of it kind of diminishes to some extent, like the scope and extent of kind of harassment and violence, but it nonetheless kind of captured the imagination. And there was a series of kind of investigative reports. There was a investigation constituted by members of the law school in my university and an external legal team. And eventually, kind of following about a 6 months process, we ended up in a situation where 3 members of academic staff were fired, and a 4th quit prior to. So there was a proceedings that had kind of been initiated, and prior to a finding being made, that person quit. So this was a kind of catalyst for some significant reforms at Wits University. But for our purposes, at least, the interesting thing was that all 4 of these academics were named in the press and had conversations, and in some cases wrote kind of lengthy kind of responses to various allegations under their own name, including some really embarrassing poetry. And Wits as a university confirmed their names, but never actually said what they'd been fired for. And this kind of set the scene. So over the last 10 years, Wits has now a kind of dedicated or what is kind of sometimes described as bespoke kind of office, the Gender Equity Office, which is responsible for handling allegations of gender-based harm. And at various points over the last 10 years, academics have been fired for misconduct. And there's 5, 6, 7, at least, sometimes quite senior professors, other instances where people have been subject to proceedings and have once again quit. So there's quite a bit of activity going on. And I should caveat this by saying, during that same period, the Gender Equity Office has also dealt with student matters. And on occasion, students have also been fired. So there's incidences that are being handled. I'm not going to pretend that they're all being handled. I'm not going to pretend that these kind of responses in terms of disciplinary panels and their outcomes are adequate in any way for dealing with broader patterns of kind of gender-based harm and problems with safety and patriarchy on campus. But at some level, there are panels being held and people are being subject to sanctions, and the university has consistently refused to say who these people are, and crucially, to also say what they've been found guilty of. And this has created really significant issues because firstly, we end up with a situation where it's necessary to go off media reports rather than to go off official statements. So there's a great deal of innuendo and speculation regarding exactly what people have been fired for, what their misconduct was, and so on. And in the absence of an official record, we end up with a situation where bullshit and innuendo fill the gap. So you'll hear kind of stories, self-serving narratives, and various other things being trotted out in order to kind of diminish and excuse people that have been found guilty of misconduct, or to allege kind of, various exercises where thumbs have been put on the scale. And as a consequence of that, there's a lot of speculation regarding exactly what people did. A colleague 10 years after my former head of department had been fired, privately revealed to me that they still had no idea what they'd done. And in that context, you have a lack of an authoritative record. But then secondly, and I think more consequentially, we have examples of people that have been fired or expelled going on to register as students at other universities or to take up academic positions at other universities. And as a consequence of the lack of an authoritative record regarding exactly what the misconduct is, you end up in a situation where people kind of basically try and leave their past behind them and end up in positions where no one's been kind of properly warned that they might be subject to similar kinds of gender harm in the future. So in response to this, my colleague Kamini Pillay and I wrote a piece in the Mail and Guardian, and it wasn't actually a response to the Tawana Coupe piece. It was that was more opportunistic, where we'd been kind of working on this for a while, and then the Coupe story came up. We were actually agitated by a gender bullying case that came out of the Faculty of Sciences, where a former head of school at Wits was subject to allegations of gender bullying. And there was a very large number of respondents and complainants and witnesses against him. And this case was epic. It took 3 years internally, and in order to kind of uphold the original finding that this senior manager had engaged in gender bullying. And this person then took the case to the CCMA, which is a kind of labor court arbitration. And that case took another 3 years. So Wits commissioned former constitutional judges to review this case, and it cost astronomical amounts of money. It took 6 years. It kind of entertained huge numbers of experts, both within the university and outside of it. And at the end of this 6-year process, this senior academic's firing was upheld by the CCMA, the labor court. And Wits University said nothing, didn't announce the findings, didn't say, look, when we say that gender harms aren't tolerated on campus, we mean, didn't remind anyone about the processes for reporting, and effectively had what people in the legal fraternity regard as a landmark case. It's gender bullying. It demonstrates that gender bullying is a distinctive form of harm The CCMA case, which I hope we can put in the notes, kind of does a really good job at setting out what gender bullying and harassment looks like. And Vit said nothing. And my concern ultimately is that when you don't provide an authoritative record, you don't say person X was fired, and you confirm through an official statement that people have been subject to sanction and that a disciplinary proceeding has upheld that sanction, you're basically kind of creating an absence. And in that absence, all kinds of bad things follow. And secondly, I do think, and this is not true for everyone, complainants and witnesses in these cases frequently want to be able to talk about their experiences. They want to say what happened to them. And in a lot of cases, it's just kind of assumed that you can't say anything. And I've talked to people who've been subject to proceedings who are unsure whether they can talk about what happened to them. So there's a cluster of things there. And the argument that we wanted to make in that piece was ultimately that under South African law, and South African law is not the same as other regimes where freedom of information and privacy legislation can sometimes prevent naming. Under South African law, there's no legal impediment to naming perpetrators. You still have to be very careful under the terms under which you name them. I think that there's a consensus that you're on the strongest ground if you name someone following a disciplinary proceeding and not before, for various reasons. And if you're going to say what they've been fired for, you also have to be very careful to provide a generic description of the misconduct that doesn't identify people who are subject to cases that don't otherwise want to be identified. But I do think that naming people works as a way of kind of signaling that systems actually sometimes work. And I'm not pretending they work all the time, because they clearly don't. But also creates a situation where we can at least mitigate some of the effects of staff and student being subject to proceedings and found guilty in those proceedings, and then moving to other universities where they are free to repeat similar kinds of misconduct. So I don't want to suggest that naming is everything, because I don't think it is. And we're talking about naming under very narrow conditions, and I can get into that later. But there's no good legal reasons why universities such as Wits in South Africa can't move to a situation where we can create an official authoritative record when people are fined for gender-based harms.
Thank you so much, Joel, for that. This is all like I'm trying to get my head around this. This is so much useful information. But then, as you say, it's important to point out that this might not be applicable to different contexts. Like, for example, in the UK, where we have laws like the GDPR, but in South Africa, there is no law which prevents naming of people with upheld findings. But when you were talking about this case as like this, this landmark case with 6 years and the amount of resources that went into it, and nobody talking about it, it's also like, if you have to look at it from that way, it's also an invisibilization of the amount of like labor by survivors, by activists, by members of staff that went into that process for 6 years into creating those processes and those pathways. And we would love to know more about it from you. But before that, I would like to move on to Judith. Judith Levine is a US journalist and feminist activist, a contributing writer to The Intercept, and the author of 5 books, the latest of which is The Feminist and the Sex Offender, Confronting Sexual Harm, Ending State Violence, co-authored by Erica Mayners. If you haven't read the book, please read it. It's really, really good. In this book, Judith and Erica write extensively about sex offender registries in the USA and how people in higher education have, and Judith writes about how people in higher education who have legally upheld findings against them may have to register as sexual offenders for life. She spoke about this in her article related to Brock Turner and the Stanford rape case, which is also there on our Twitter if you want to read and engage with the article. Thank you so much for joining us today, Judith. We really appreciate it, especially because it's so early for you in New York. But the first question that I would like to ask you is that, recently there has been some discussions around having institutional lists, like university managed lists of perpetrators who have had upheld findings of sexual violence in universities, similar to some ways in the sexual offender registries that you write about. And so I wanted to ask you, like, how would you respond to such calls being made within the higher education sector?
Thank you for having me. And I just want to preface what I'm saying as that I'm speaking from the US context, and I don't know a lot about the South African context, except in as much as you have this historic institution of transformative justice, of restorative justice in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has been criticized 3 decades on precisely because it did not deliver justice. It may have delivered truth and some kind of reconciliation, but many generations later, there is still racial and economic injustice in South Africa. So, so when I speak about transformative and restorative responses to the problems that are on the table, that's even a kind of a prehistory to the history that has gone on in the United States. I think it's really important when you are going to make a reform to know what you really want in the end. And that is what your real vision is. You know, what is the intention of the reform? Because if you may be making things better in a small way now, you might end up pushing the whole thing in the wrong direction and needing to backtrack, or that there will be unintended consequences. And the United States, both in the context of higher education and also the state generally, has had many unintended consequences, particularly from the standpoint of anti-violence feminism. I think the state's context, the state's intention in all of its carceral doings is simply to punish and to make, an example of people have done wrong, presumably to deter others from doing the same, which actually research shows doesn't really work. Deterrence of that sort does not really work to stop people from committing crimes. So, but what did feminists want? We want, in the biggest picture, a world without sexual violence. We want a world in which it will be unthinkable for a person in a position of power to use his position of power to extract sex and other favors from somebody in lesser power. And in was very struck in Kiki's film that the students who were harassed by these professors were not just students. They were not just women. They tended to be women who might have been the first people in their families to go to college. They don't have money. They didn't have connections. Their families had none. So they were really super vulnerable, including Kiki herself. And thinking about this intersectionality, the intersectionality of this, I think is important. So what are the intentions here? The first intention, I think, is most practical: to provide safe spaces for students to be able to go about their education without worrying that somebody is going to, pull them into a room and sexually abuse them. The second is that we do not want people who have perpetrated these crimes to do them again. We don't want them to do them again where they are, and we don't want them to go someplace else, unbeknownst to that administration, and do them again there. We want some kind of justice. Now, what justice means to individuals and to the state, or in this case, the institutions of higher learning, does not have the same meanings. And I'm saying, these intentions overlap. They're not mutually exclusive. but they often will confound one another when you actually start to put in place practical responses to them. We want justice. Does justice mean punishment, or does it mean accountability? In other words, do we want simply for a person to suffer harm commensurate to the harm that he has imposed on somebody else? Or do we want him really to know what he has done, to understand the harm that he has done, and to make some kind of repair and change in the direction of not doing it again? Not because he's afraid of losing his job, but he actually understands the harm that he has done. That's a different kind of accountability, which is often foreclosed by the system of punishment. Because when you are being punished or when you are on trial, your job is to deny that you did it, even if you did do it. And if you did do it, you didn't do it so much. And your defense attorneys, I don't know whether people have an attorney in these kind of proceedings in South Africa or Nigeria. But your job is to deny that you did what you did. And, I know many people who are in prison who still deny that they did what they did. And those who finally come around to recognizing that they did do it, that is a big moment of change in their lives. And what does punishment mean? I think in the context of a list, and I'm not entirely sure whether this is a public list, who has access to this list. That's a very, very important aspect of this. Is this something that goes on that seems to me perfectly reasonable, that this would be something that would go on the person's record and that the next institution who might be hiring him would have access to that record? But are you going to put up a list somewhere for students coming into the university that these are the guys who have done wrong? That is a permanent pariahship. Once that's online or once that is publicly available, you will never escape it. So do you want to, and that is a shaming list. And that's its main, even if that's not its immediate intention, that is certainly its result. So, and in the long run, what kind of a community do we want to have? Do we want a community in which we can speak to one another, repair harm, and ultimately re-embrace a person who has done harm back into the community with the sometimes, delusionary idea that this person might do better? But, the principle of restorative justice is that everybody is redeemable. We don't hold anybody to the worst things that they've ever done. We hope that they can change and they can understand. So how do we think through what the intentions are? So that's the first thing. The process of naming people on public registries by the state and the states has, in the United States, resulted in almost 1 million people on easily publicly accessible lists that anybody can go to on the internet. Along with these lists come multiple restrictions on where they can live, where they can work, whom they can live with, whether they can worship at a certain church, if they can go to a mall, if they can simply be at a bus stop or in a park or go fishing somewhere. Their lives are immensely restricted, and they are such pariahs that the American sociologist Orlando Patterson called this social death, which is what he called slavery, American slavery. And so Joel said that, of course, each person should have the right to be able to go on and get another job in another institution. But if you are on a public list, that's really just wishful thinking. So I'll start, and then I guess the last thing is that this kind of institution, when I hear Joel speak, has the very important the intention of showing that the institution, the state, the system of higher education really cares about this issue, that this is really important, that this is not just something that goes by that we try to put under the rug. And to me, what was so striking about Kiki's film is how you see that this is systemic, that the impunity, we're not talking about some bad guys, but you have an entire system that is built up to defend that person, to find no wrongdoing, to let that person continue to do whatever he does. And then we can talk later about, are there other ways that we could achieve these, that we could achieve like an equal and, gender equal and safe place for people to learn, that is without these carceral responses, because it is a carceral response. So you're not necessarily criminalizing somebody and putting them in prison, but it is a punishment response essentially. So actually, Joel, what form, I'm interested, I mean, is this public? I mean, how would someone access this? Where is it? Who has access? So on.
Oh,
Can I come in, or
Yeah, I mean,
I have
it
quite a
sort
bit
of
to
needs to
say
be
in
clarified
response.
to me anyway.
yeah, sure. Because I don't think like Joel was talking about the list in particular. Joel
No.
is speaking about a specific case. I think when I said like we've heard calls from like, during our research or like discussions with people, we've heard people like mention that universities should have registries. So I just wanted to clarify that. But maybe what we can do is at the end, before we go on to our audience questions, we can have a round of questions between Judith and Joel. If that's okay with both of you? Would that be okay? Yeah, perfect. Joel, did you want to come in with anything now?
I have quite a few things to say, but I'm not sure I can say them briefly. So I don't know how you want me to respond.
Let me first, I just do want to interject that I really thank you, Joel, for this extremely meticulous, morally and politically meticulous piece of argument that you've done for this. I really thought your article was really excellent. So thank you for that.
Joel, maybe we can, because I wanted to ask you about, like, my next question was directed towards you, and I wanted to ask more about the legal opinion, basically. So should I just put my question across to you, and then you can do the response and the answer to that question, because I feel like they might be interlinked.
Yeah, no, that's fine. If that's
as well. But before we move into the question, I just want to tell everyone that we have had now an email from Kiki to say that she was pulled into an emergency. Kiki is a working journalist, and there was something that urgent that popped up, and she's trying to join us, but she's stuck in transit with really bad network coverage. So she is really trying to join us and find a place where she can find some network, and we're keeping our fingers crossed that she will be able to join us towards the second half of this panel. But if not, we will share, like we have already shared the link to Kiki's film on our Twitter, but we will try and do something with Kiki, maybe record a talk with her, or we'll find ways to bring Kiki into this conversation as well, because I think her voice is in this discussion that we are having today is really important. But going back to you, Joel, the question that I wanted to ask you was that, could you tell us a bit about the legal opinion? You've already posted that on the chat, I think. And what impact could this have in the context of South African higher education?
Okay, thanks. So I'm maybe going to try and fold my response to Judith into some of the conversations about the legal opinion. I just need to firstly clarify, it's really important here to draw a sharp distinction between civil and criminal procedures and the internal disciplinary procedures that universities such as WITS in South Africa run. So we need to be really clear that registries for sex offenders and the types of kind of carceral logics that are inherent in those types of regimes are nothing remotely to close to what we're talking about. We're talking about a situation where it's a civil procedure governed by university policies that still have to be rigorous. And at WITS, at least, there are procedures that have been specifically designed and tailored to deal with questions of gender-based harm, such that some of the potential for secondary victimization that is inherent to all of these processes are minimized while still maintaining the integrity of the overall system. So I can talk a little bit about that. So a lot of work has gone into the design, but I will concede, and I think this is an important point, that as someone who sat on a whole bunch of disciplinary committees, there are multiple occasions that universities in South Africa end up with dealing with conduct that under different circumstances would meet standards for criminal behavior. So sexual violence, rape, assault, extreme kind of examples, and we all know that a continuum of kind of, you know, lesser and extreme is not always useful, because it kind of minimizes and excuses anything that's sort of kind of spectacular kind of physical sexual violence. But it is worth noting that because of the limitations of the South African police service and the problems inherent in the prosecution of sexual offenses in South Africa, and let's be clear, South Africa has very high levels of sexual violence in lots of ways, universities end up with cases that are criminal through disciplinary procedures that are in essence civil. And what that means is, firstly, universities are dealing with really, really difficult cases at a panel and disciplinary level. But, and this is crucial, the sanctions available to a university disciplinary panel look nothing like criminal procedure. So we can't put people on registers, we can't put people in jail. The most significant procedure which is available here is to fire or expel someone. And I want to note here that there are issues in terms of what happens when you decide that misconduct is short of a fireable offense. So the expiring expulsion is a sanction that's not always used, but it's a sanction that is used on occasion. But if that sanction is not employed, the other remedies available arising out of a disciplinary panel are, for want of a better word, unsatisfactory. So in addition to firing and expulsion, WITS has, through the Gender Equity Office, a process of gender sensitization training. And that gender sensitization training is one of the things that can be mandated out of a disciplinary commission where someone has to go. And as someone who kind of works closely with the people who do that training, there's a great deal of dissatisfaction with the idea of gender sensitization training. And inherent in that is the idea of transitional justice always sounds way better in theory than it actually does in practice. And the major impediment we have within gender sensitization training is that the people don't think they've done anything wrong. And it's a 10-week mandatory course that's dedicated. A lot of resources are put into it. It's kind of psychosocial work by professional social workers, and people that are subject to these kinds of interventions at week 6 still are arguing the toss in relation to what misconduct they actually engaged in and whether it was actually misconduct. So the ideal of transitional justice assumes, arising out of its origins in restorative justice, that some kind of therapeutic intervention will change a psychological state such that people have a new attitude and orientation. And based on the experience at WITS in relation to this gender sensitization training, I just don't think that's the case. It becomes a script that people have to follow. So I'm anxious about the degree to which transformative or transitional justice gets celebrated as something that in lots of ways operates at a high level of abstraction and doesn't actually correlate to the change in attitude that is desired as the end state. So I think we've got to be really careful here. And we have examples of situations where colleagues of people that have been fired have been invited back to the university to give talks. They've kept their email addresses. They remain as collaborators. Because there's no record of what they've done, the nature of their transgressions can be minimized and dismissed, and consequently, they remain in good standing. This idea of a badge of shame in lots of ways is in lots of ways, I think it would be better if people were on occasion a little less confident in their capacity to bluster through and ignore having committed wrongdoing and engaged in harm. So I just think that there's a degree of anxiety here. And I'm going to be honest, I just flat out reject this reference to social death. As someone who spent 20 years of my life studying slavery, the whole idea that the forms of dishonor and vulnerability and marginalization and sexual violence that are inherent to slavery as a condition, as a kinless outsider that's natively alienated from all people around you, is in any way equivalent to the types of conditions we're talking about today, is a grave injustice and trivialization of the inherent violence in slavery. And I just really, really find that objectionable. So in terms of the legal opinion, one of the concerns that we have as a university is that people have said for a very long time, you can't name. So South African law, you can't name people. It just can't be done legally. And the problem that we have is that no one ever actually got a legal opinion. It was a kind of hearsay thing. There's legal impediments to naming people. We don't know exactly what they are, but we're very confident that you can't name legally. So my colleagues and I, early last year, decided that we would actually test this. So we approached a law firm that worked with Wits University. We asked for an opinion on the legal status of naming. We were originally quoted an astronomical amount of money for that opinion because legal opinions are always very expensive. And in this context, eventually we ended up with a pro bono opinion that addressed the question as to whether or not, under defamation and privacy law within a South African context, universities in South Africa could publicly name people who were found guilty of misconduct following a disciplinary proceeding. And the opinion that came back confirmed a couple of things. Firstly, there's a truth and public interest defense around questions associated with defamation. But more specifically, the opinion says that universities such as Wits can exercise qualified privilege, by which they have the privilege to name people following a disciplinary proceeding. They also said, and this is something I can probably maybe get into in the question and answer session, that freedom of information and privacy legislation probably do not prevent naming following a disciplinary proceeding. Now, the probably stems from the fact that Papaya, the privacy legislation that's applicable in South Africa, only came into force very recently. So I want to be clear here, Wits could have named prior to Papaya coming in and didn't. And now Papaya is coming in, there's this additional complication around freedom of information. And the reason we're not 100% sure whether it violates freedom of information is because we're in a situation where there's just no case law. So it's likely that under under privacy legislation, that this disclosure is in the public interest, but there's a debate around what we know as special protected information. And the threshold for disclosure of special protected information is higher than the disclosure associated with regular information. And there's a debate over whether the special protected information provisions relating to what the information describes as sex life falls under the additional threshold of scrutiny associated with special protected information. Now, my reading of this is that describing sexual harassment and bullying as an example of a sex life too easily and too comfortably privileges the experience and perspective of the person perpetrating abuse. So having kind of harassment and bullying in the workplace as become a property of someone's sex life strikes me as misguided and kind of a stretch in terms of its applications. But we have to be very careful here, because there's no case law. We're going to need to approach what they call the information regulator in order to confirm or try and confirm that it's possible to disclose. So this legal opinion, I don't know if it's been circulated, but it definitely can be. It's his way of confidentiality, and it can be made available to anyone in South Africa and beyond. What I want to do with this opinion, and this is not my opinion, this is something my colleagues and I have worked on for many years, is to remove the argument that is made that we just can't name. I want to move to a situation where universities have to face up to the situation that they can name, but have decided for various reasons not to name. So the position that, and there's arguments about under what terms you name, what threshold for disclosure might apply, given the range of kind of transgressions that might arise out of a disciplinary panel. But you just have to be in a situation where you can't run a blanket, non-specific, gestury legal argument that says that you can't name perpetrators in South African universities. At the very least, this legal opinion needs to face up to the position that there's a strong legal basis for potentially naming, and then universities in South Africa actually have to face up to the more difficult decision about when and how to undertake that step.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Joel, for that. And there's so much information. And I want to say that there's a question in the Q&A bit. So please feel free to engage with that as well if you want to thanking you for the intervention. So I want to move to Judith now, and again, like specifying that, like as you mentioned, Joel, that you're not talking about institutional lists, but I want to, because there is a growing call among like academics and students that we have heard who are kind of wanting to advocate for an institutional list. I just wanted to, in your work, you talk at length about how any form of like institutional lists could disproportionately affect minority communities, and in what ways could that happen? And yeah, I mean, and then I'll have another round of very quick questions for both of you, because I'm very keen to move on to the Q&A, because we have some really interesting questions there as well. But over to you, Judith.
Yes, it is true that, I mean, it sounds like what you're talking about, Joel, is that mostly these disciplinary boards would be dealing with what we call sexual harassment legally in the United States, which is not sex, even though it has a sexual, expression. It is the use of power in order to extract a quid pro quo, and that quid pro quo is some sort of sexual attention, and it can be done by extortion or bribes or threats or violence, violent coercion. So and I do think that actually the law of sexual harassment in the United States is well developed. It doesn't necessarily work. For instance, Ford Motor Company has now paid out billions of dollars in sexual harassment fines, and there's still sexual harassment on the shop floor. So how much does the culture change with even large sanctions? That's a good question. So I do think the problem of sex life, it seems to me surmountable in as much as what you define as sexual harassment. Sexual is a sort of smaller word compared to harassment. To answer your question, Adria, that yes, for instance, in U.S. Universities, many students have been brought before disciplinary boards because of what is perceived or felt to be sexual harm by another student, usually a female student, against a male student. And they have, for instance, at Colgate University, which is kind of expensive, elite-ish college in 2017, Black students comprised 4.2% of the student body. They accounted for half of the sexual violation accusations reported to the school, and 40% of the students put through the formal disciplinary process. So yes, that does happen. I mean, I think in a Nigerian context where this is a largely Black country with a very small white population, is different from South Africa. It's a different history, you know, colonial, settler colonialism and so on. But yes, in the United States, this definitely does happen. And it's not only that. I wrote a piece about a university where some professors had been sexually harassing students. They were suspended. They came back. Students wanted everyone's name who had ever been accused of such a thing to be published. And it turned out that the large number of them were people like who worked in the who were like sweepers or worked in the cafeteria. I mean, these were people who have no power whatsoever in the institution. And so economically as well, those kinds of biases are expressed inevitably in any kind of system. But I do want to push back a little bit about this question of, I guess what I would call a cynicism about restorative practices. I am a restorative justice practitioner, so I know how limited it is. I often feel that the only thing I'm doing is trying to keep somebody out of juvenile justice or, you know, out of a criminal punishment. There is, and also, you know, to say, you know, nothing is as bad as slavery. Yes, that is true. Nothing, you know, we could say nothing was ever as bad as, you know, as the Holocaust of the, you know, 1940s. End of story. I mean, so, but to lose your job forever, to lose your family relationship forever, to lose your reputation forever, to not be able to live anywhere and be homeless forever, those are really terrible things to happen to a person, and they don't have to be as bad as chattel slavery to be very bad. So, the reason for restorative justice is not just to be nice. It's actually not a nice it sounds like this gender sensitivity training is one of these bullshit things where they sit a person down and make them listen to stuff and have, you know, cards that go up on the difference in a restorative or transformative process is that the person who is harmed it is centered around her experience. She gets to say what the harm is, and she, in addition to the people in the circle, get to talk about what would be healing to her, what would be satisfying to her to make a change. And that can be a lot of different things. So because, and I think this is possibly true, I mean, you know, in the US, if somebody is fired for something and they have been found to be guilty of it, you can say it. I mean, the institution can say it. So, you know, so the next question to me is like, okay, now what do we do with this person? You know, now that we've done that, what is our ultimate goal? We want to not have these people over and over. And the reason that they don't say it, you know it, is that the universities don't want to be themselves liable. They don't want to look bad themselves. How did this possibly happen at our pristine university, right? That's why they don't talk about it, not because they're necessarily protecting this guy or that guy. These kinds of institutions, and even the disciplinary, you know, these disciplinary panels are what they are. They're the same people from the same institution who are covering up this, you know, decades and decades of sexual harassment and sexual abuse of students. So why this institution is going to be, you know, a pristine, benign, you know, hardworking, you know, disinterested body. I mean, I think we really need to think about who does these things, and in real practice, how do they work? You know, that there is no clean, unbiased, institutional body. I mean, so I know that you have clearly thought about how to try to protect that process as much as possible from other influences. But I do think we should not be in the least bit naive about the possibility of what, and I'm going to call it the state in this case, it is the institution, is capable of doing. So the question is, how does the person who has been harmed feel satisfied? How is she healed? How is she, how is her problem answered? And the problem with retributive justice is it doesn't necessarily work. The harmed person doesn't feel she's been heard often. She never gets to speak to the person who has harmed her, which is so often, I mean, I've had stuff like this happen to me. The first thing you want to do is tell this fucking guy what they did to you to his face. You never get to do that. So the harmed person often feels frustrated. Often after, the cop who has shot your son goes to prison, you feel justice has been done. And yet 20 years later, you still have lost your son. And where does that go? So the kind of justice that you get from firing a person from saying his name, it's often distant from the relationship, this hideous relationship that has been built between this person with power and the person without power, and the person without power using the institution to exact justice is often really unsatisfying and doesn't really give closure and doesn't change the institution. I mean, so as I said before, these goals and processes are not all mutually exclusive. And you said whether this harmed person themselves, you spoke about whether the harmed person herself should have some say in whether there is a disclosure and a public disclosure or not. And you thought that it would be better to simply have a system of that happening or not happening. And I actually think that having that person have a say would be an important part of it. Because it's these overlaps between a person's body and self and an institute and its relationship and an institution, and then the society in which the institution lives. So, yeah, so I just want to speak up for, against these stupid sensitivity training shit and for true restorative practice, as limited and imperfect as it is.
Brilliant. Thank you, Judith and Joel. Maybe we could take the last round of very short question from me before we kind of go on to taking some of the audience questions, because there are quite a few questions and they're all very interesting. So I do want to have us and an opportunity to engage with the audience. I mean, in terms of naming, so I think this is something that both of you have spoken about, but I wanted to ask this question to both of you. It's the same question, in terms of accountability and justice, Joel, what extent do you feel that naming is important? But kind of changing the question slightly and taking it to you, Judith, because you write about TJ and RJ and how naming, how people should not be named in that process. So it's the same question, but I just wanted to direct it to both of you in terms of to understand the importance of naming or not naming. Joel, to you first, if that's okay, and then we can move on to Judith.
Yeah, I just, if I could step back a little bit, I mean, my intervention is very focused around a formal statement by a university which names that someone has been fired and which includes a carefully crafted and anonymized account of what they've been fired for that doesn't identify respondents and witnesses. That is the position that I'm advocating for, and my broader argument is that there's no legal impediment to universities in South Africa adopting that. I just want to note, naming is happening all over already. So we have the reference list that the university currently known at Rhodes. We have names being slipped under doors of kind of pieces. We have anonymous notes written in Gmail accounts that go out on listservs accusing people of misconduct. We have references to rape and sexual violence and harassment on Twitter. So like, people are being named regularly already. They're being named in social media platforms, in newspaper reports, and so on and so forth. So I think we've got to be clear that the question is not whether or not to name, because there's names circulating. The problem is, and we saw this in a recent legal proceeding at Cape Town, where a student named someone as is engaged in sexual violence. That name was not something that could withstand legal scrutiny. And as a consequence, there was a defamation ruling against a student by someone who'd been named as a perpetrator of sexual violence. So there's issues with names. There's vulnerabilities associated with names. If you name someone a rapist on Twitter, you're subject to legal vulnerability and scrutiny, because if someone wants to engage in defamation, they are within their rights to basically prove that the sexual violence actually happened, which we all know is extremely difficult to do. So in any discussion of naming, I kind of feel like universities, as people with legal departments, as budgets and all the rest of it, are more positioned or better positioned than other potential actors that are already engaged in naming when it comes to kind of putting something out and having the basis to defend that from a defamation claim. So I've talked to our legal office here at WITS, and they keep going, a register would be better, universities should kind of coordinate and so on. But the bottom line is that someone has to go first. And my university has the resources to go first. And that would be what I would advocate for. At the same time, I think there's a danger of understanding naming as a radical move when it's actually quite conservative. So we're talking about a very narrow set of conditions. We're not talking about naming people when they're subject to allegations, because we can't demonstrate those allegations. We're not talking about naming people when they're going through disciplinary proceedings for all kinds of reasons, both kind of good and bad. People who are subject to proceedings are subject to very kind of stringent confidentiality standards, and consequently, you can go for as long as a proceeding lasts without any kind of public disclosure regarding what's going on within those proceedings. And it's worth noting that people still quit before findings are made against them. And under these conditions, I still don't have a good legal foundation as to whether or not we can name people who quit prior to proceedings. And this happens a lot. I've been member on disciplinary panels where I get sent the packet of evidence and I'm going, oh, that's an overwhelming case. And then a couple of weeks later, I get an email going that the respondent in this case is withdrawn from the proceedings and left the university. And at that point, we still don't know whether we can name under those circumstances. So we should know at this point about empathy, the kind of excessive deference that is given to people, men in positions of power. We should know that university professors, because they have big salaries, can employ lawyers to fight university procedures to the death. And there's a huge attrition going on here where cases get knocked out, people don't want to proceed, a decision is made that the evidence base is inadequate or insufficient, or, you know, there's all kinds of ways in which these proceedings get kind of tested or pushed or compromised in various ways. It's really hard to hold on to the integrity of your proceeding in a context where a senior professor is the respondent. And only a tiny number of people go through these processes. And it's at the end of this process, we're not prepared to name them, and they just get fired and they go and get another job, and then they place themselves in the position where they remain in good standing. that strikes me as an extension and application of empathy. And we really need to be in a situation where if we have some trust in the integrity of our proceedings, and at the end of all of these processes, they've been found guilty, someone needs to know about it. And there's no legal reason why we can't name people at the end of these processes, because so few people come out the bottom end of that funnel. It's not going to stop impunity. It's not going to deal with institutionalized abuse of power that's inherent to hierarchy in universities. But at some level, we really need to be in a situation where occasionally we can tell someone about the harms that have been perpetrated and that they were actually held accountable. At the same time, and I'll try and be quick, I do think that transformative justice and restorative justice provisions are extremely valuable, but in lots of ways, I actually think they have better applications to relationships between communities within universities, like residences or departments or units and so on. So one of the things I've kind of discovered in my research is that when members of academic staff are subject to allegations of gender-based harm, departments and units of the university kind of divide into tribes. There's people who support the person who has been subject to allegations, and there's others who support the person who's made the kind of allegation against them. And this fractures bonds. University spaces become incredibly toxic. Everyone plays guess the respondent, guess the witness. And this collegiality and common kind of bonds that you need to have a functioning university or a functioning residence are deeply tested by disciplinary proceedings. And I've seen this. There's multiple parts of my university where senior members of management and senior professors will continue to run this rogue feminist bullshit, where they'll say that people kind of, oh, the feminist got out of hand. It was a good man and he was taken down too soon in his prime, and all that self-serving bullshit. And this is where I think transformative and restorative justice interventions are actually necessary. They're still problematic because you can't force someone to engage in restorative justice. It has to be voluntary. And coercing someone into these kind of spaces can be really harmful for them. And this is why the gender sensitization training doesn't work particularly well. A lot of kind of complainants and witnesses don't want to see the person that abused them ever again. They don't want the emotional labor of participating in a restorative process. They just want this person fired and out of their lives. So consequently, we have problems with participation, which is why it's a social worker and not the complainant. But I do think if you want to repair a hall of residence, if you want to repair a department or unit or school within the university, you have to engage in a restorative justice process, which engages with colleagues and students that are more than an individual relationship between someone who perpetrates abuse and someone who is subject to abuse. And it's in this context, I think transformative justice is really valuable. But the TRC in South Africa, whatever its problems, and they were very profound, started with the idea that you can only have reconciliation in the wake of truth. So if we want to rebuild bonds between colleagues in different parts of the university, we have to start with the truth that someone was fired for misconduct, and that there was an integrity to the system and that they deserved to be fired. And consequently, if you want to repair bonds broken by disciplinary proceedings, you have to start with the basic fact that there were good reasons for this person to be fired. And you can only do that if you disclose their names and their kind of principal offenses. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with self-serving obfuscation that blames feminism on all kinds of social ills in which no one repairs anything. And you end up in these polarized tribes years after disciplinary proceedings have been concluded.
Thank you so much, Joel. Judith, I'll very quickly pass it on to you for your comments. And I'm just going to try and see if Kiki is there. Kiki, are you able to hear us?
Yes, I'm able to hear you.
Oh, we
Can't hear her.
Yeah, we can't hear you very well, but I'll come straight to you after Judith's response. Judith,
Uh,
over to you.
Yeah.
Won't say a whole lot. I mean, it seems to me that it would be possible to have some sort of system whereby if somebody goes to apply for a job in another university, that there would be some requirement that that new hirer would refer back to the former, the former employer and see if this person has a record of sexual harassment or that they have been, found guilty of. So that that might be something that is, in between these. This question of libel, I don't know, in the US anyway, if you're a public figure, it's very hard to charge to win a libel suit. And I think it's arguable the person, certainly a highly placed person in a university is such a public person. It'd be different if that person in the disciplinary proceeding was simply a student, for instance. That'd be a different thing. So it does seem like you could sort of cut this off by just making sure that there's better communication between, when the person goes and applies for another job. And you bring up this kind of dense organism of communication, which is, there's the institution that has its formal ways of talking, and then there's social media, and there's the gossip in the dorm, and there's don't take that guy's course because he's a bastard, or don't take that because then don't go into his office because he's going to try to rape you. All of those things. I think the rumor mill is an important source of information. It has always been among people who are not in power, and it has always been for women around sexual harm. It can be very unfair, and the way that it just proliferates makes things really horrible for an accused person who might be innocent. At the same time, I think we can continue to trust that people in the dorm or, students will be telling each other about these guys. And so I think that's a good thing. So, yeah, I mean, I think your proposal, Joel, is a pretty limited one, straightforward one. And I don't know what happens there, but I think you should always be careful about how these things proliferate. Oh, that's a good idea to do that. Let's do it for this other thing. Let's do it for people who've cheated. Let's do it. And so that's what I mean by a carceral logic. There's not a complete separation between civil action and carceral, except in terms of what kind of penalties there are. But socially, there are many similarities. So, yeah, I mean, I guess in Britain, it's very easy to charge somebody with libel and to win a libel case. It's sort of the opposite of the US. So, as I said, I mean, I came to this, with humility and curiosity because I don't know your system. And I just am kind of the ghost of Christmas future. Like, don't do whatever the US does, don't do it. My final statement.
Thank you, Judith. And I think I just want to remind everyone that, one of the reasons why we decided to do this panel was we were all in this space of we don't know. We have so many questions, but we don't know. And it's also different in different contexts. So we wanted to create the space where we can, a safe space where we can have these honest discussions. And I really want to thank you both for being so honest and, for giving us so much of your time and sharing your knowledge and experiences. Steve, like Kiki is still not fully there, and like I don't think she can fully hear us. So
I can hear you guys, but it keeps going off and on. That's the issue. So I can hear you.
That's fine. Kiki, if you can hear us, we can hear you. Welcome, first of all. Thank you so much for joining us.
I know. Apologies for the tardiness. I have been struggling and I've heard some of the submissions, brilliantly put. I've just, it's just been a bit annoying having to just like leave and come back because the internet picking me out.
Kiki, I would really like to formally introduce you to our audience because we haven't done that. And so let me just quickly introduce Kiki. Kiki is an Emmy-nominated journalist and documentary filmmaker. She's also the founder and creative director of Document Women, an online media platform dedicated to battling the erasure of women by documenting their contributions to society. In 2019, Kiki made a groundbreaking award-winning film called Sex for Grades with BBC Africa Eye, exposing extensive sexual abuse by lecturers in some of West Africa's most prestigious universities and naming some very powerful perpetrators. We have shared the link to Kiki's amazing film on our Twitter. Oh no. But anyways, but we will share the link again. And we will try to, get Kiki to engage with some of the questions that we have. Kiki, are you here again?
I'm here again.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Feel free to keep your video switched off, Kiki, because we know that you have a connection. But we would be really, we really want to know a little bit about why did you feel important to make the film Sex for Grades? And while making that film, why did you think it was important to name the perpetrators? And what led you to take that step of naming the powerful perpetrators?
All right. Naming was a huge part of why we did all of what we did. Because we did the research. This is not the first time an article or a call out like that had been made in the past. But something that was really consistent was a media trial and a traumatization of victims. And that wasn't the path that we wanted to follow. It was very clear that every time that a woman came out to tell her story or out an abuser.
Oh no. I think the best thing might be to, Kiki?
I don't know if you can hear me. Oh yeah.
We can hear you again, but I was wondering if it might be better because your connection keeps going for us to have some of these discussions, or for me to send you some of these questions and for us to either do written responses or recorded responses after.
Absolutely, I'm more than happy to do that.
Yeah, it might be better because the connection keeps getting cut and we can't hear you very clearly.
I did not anticipate, I'm in a different city from Lagos. I did not anticipate that it would be like this, so apologies. But yeah, I will send written responses.
Kiki, that's absolutely fine. This also says something about connectivity and where connectivity is centered and it's not. So like, that's absolutely fine. No need to apologize. These things happen. But like, I will chat with Kiki after and make sure that, we get a conversation going about her film as well. And Kiki, please feel free to be on the call and listen in and chime in whenever you want. Joel and Judith, would you be happy if I moved on to taking some of the questions at this point?
Great, but I also just want to reiterate that everyone on this call should watch Kiki's film, Sex for Grades, which is incredibly powerful, moving, nauseating, brave. It's an amazing film. Congratulations, Kiki.
Yeah, I mean, I second everything that Judith said. The first question's for Joel, actually. Joel, so there's a question about the term gender bullying. And is there legislation in South Africa that defines bullying and how that works in relation to personal characteristics? We don't have legislative protection against bullying in the UK, so we can't legally prove something happened would constitute as bullying. And a second question, which might be related, is that are survivors given information or consequences if there is an upheld finding, or do you, in your procedures, involve the police? at any stage. So that one's for you, Joel. And for Judith, there's a question around sexual violence often sexual misconduct in universities can consist of issues such as grooming or boundary blurring behavior, where power relations and trust is abused. So how do we address such issues, and how does naming work without any carceral implications? How might some of that, especially when it comes to staff-student relationships, be addressed? I'll go to you, Joel, first, and then go to Judith.
Okay, so this is just to circle back to the CCMA and proceedings regarding the former head of school. One of the things that makes that a landmark ruling, and I put it in the chat so you can kind of download it, is that it constitutes a legal ruling that has binding precedent within South African kind of labor arbitration and labor court proceedings regarding what gender bullying is. So prior to that ruling, the case law and kind of judicial kind of record around gender bullying was extremely thin. So that is part of it. And we did a kind of panel on this where we talked to the lawyers who prosecuted this, and sorry, prosecuted is the wrong term. It's not a criminal procedure, it's a civil one. But basically talking about pattern behavior. So the CCMA ruling and the internal proceedings that happen at WITS prior to it getting to the labor court involved huge numbers of respondents. So like you can basically see patterns of behavior that were linked through the ruling that demonstrated that women within this department, and there were some student respondents in the cases at various stages as well, were subject to bullying on the basis of gender, and they were treated in ways that were fundamentally and different to how male colleagues were treated. So gender bullying, and I can't do justice to the whole case. As I said, the thing took 6 years before a final ruling, creates the basis for gender bullying. And this is why lawyers are very excited. This case is already being cited in other judgments. So in South Africa, we have a definition that is operationally useful within some legal environment. At the same time, South African criminal law doesn't have gender bullying as a specific form of misconduct. It's kind of very much around the model of sexual violence that I think we're probably all familiar with in lots of respects. So the criminal law and how labor law and how WITS internal procedures define gender harms are obviously different. In terms of how kind of survivors and kind of complainants deal with cases, the WITS system tries to separate out a finding on the merits from a finding on sanctions. So the first consideration in any kind of disciplinary proceedings, and the disciplinary proceedings are a 3-person panel, 1 gender expert chaired by someone with legal experience, and then a senior academic or student rep, depending on the nature of the respondent. A finding is made through a disciplinary panel, firstly regarding the facts of the matter, and the evaluative standard here is balance of probabilities, which is a different criminal standard to kind of the more familiar kind of proof, reasonable doubt standard. And then once a finding has been made, there's a separate and additional sanctions hearing. And it's at that point where submissions get made by respondents as to what they think the most likely, most potentially plausible sanction might be. So I guess that's how it should be handled. I would note, I'm not sure. I want to be very careful here. I've spent a lot of time and energy over kind of quite a bit of time trying to make sure that the VITS procedures work as they should. I definitely don't want to be claiming under any circumstances that they actually work the way they're supposed to a lot of the time. And there's multiple problems and flaws. And I do think one of the biggest problems we had was VITS lost a case on procedural grounds involving another senior professor. And the university handled that case atrociously, where no one who was subject to similarly grueling cases was actually informed why the case had collapsed, what the respondent was, and because the case had collapsed, this professor ended up kind of back amongst their colleagues with a whole bunch of respondents and witnesses whose identities were kind of known through the proceedings to them, and the university did an incredibly atrocious job of handling that case. And I think that's an extreme example, but there are other examples of this where complainants and witnesses haven't been updated, haven't been told what happened, never received apologies or kind of any kind of recognition. At the CCMA proceedings, we had one person give evidence for 5 days straight regarding horribly traumatic experiences at the hands of this perpetrator who was her immediate line supervisor. And the university never reckoned with that. They never grappled with its effects and the psychological damage associated with the strain of these proceedings. So there's always a lot to be done. And of course, the vast majority of cases never get before a panel in the first place.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joel. Judith, do you want to come in?
So the question again is about power and how to deal with power imbalance, grooming, and so on. I really think this is one of these things that has to do with politics and culture. And, you know, a lawsuit is not politics. And the only way that even the idea that a person can be, you know, grooming another person to exploit her or him requires a kind of, first of all, a sense of collective power. It's not just that I, an individual student of 18 years old, has the strength to be able to put my hand up and say stop to, you know, a very powerful professor. But those kinds of changes in which the student feels not only strong enough, but also that she has is within a community that will stand up for her. You know, in the 1960s, there was a big movement in Europe, and I'm not sure about whether this happened in unis in Africa, but to change the ways that students and instructors viewed one another as a much more, you know, horizontal kind of structure, that there was not the huge amount of hierarchy. You know, it had its problems, and probably some of them were that people took, you know, advantage of others sexually because of that horizontal and more informal structure. But I do think that that kind of democratization of a university is an important part, and feminism, which you know, in which we recognize, meaning everyone recognizes that there's just certain kinds of behavior that is not okay, and nobody will stand up for it. And so one of the ways is by having institutions that take it seriously and take steps. But I think really this is much more of a political movement and, you know, public emotion kind of change that has to happen.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Judith. We have a question here, another question here for Joel, which says, can you reflect a bit on how disciplinary processes and procedures in universities can actually be used to silence and punish not the perpetrators, but actually the survivors and whistleblowers? given that disciplinary regimes tend to work in a way that complement existing power structures, such that abusers in power end up benefiting from them. I think this question could be both for Judith and Joel, if you both could respond to it. And another question which I have for Joel is that when you speak of naming, it is the basis of that is that a thorough investigation has taken place with integrity on the part by the institution. But in most cases, that does not happen. And even when a survivor is willing to file complaints, that complaint process doesn't go ahead because it's silenced by institutions. So what happens in those circumstances? And so that's a question for you. But the first question, I think, if both Judith and Joel could respond to.
Yeah, if anyone knows how to fix this, I'd really appreciate kind of some input and advice, because there's absolutely no doubt that internal procedures can be turned against kind of complainants. That people can be threatened, they can be informally sanctioned, and it's not uncommon in some cases for people to be kind of threatened with other forms of proceedings, HR proceedings or student disciplinary proceedings. And I don't know how to fix that. And there's no doubt, and this has come out in a lot of my work, that there's a stronger stress test of processes when proceedings involve academics relative to students. So when you talk, I mean, there's some variation in South African kind of context. Student representative councils are kind of training areas for people who want to launch their political careers. So the SRCs have a different kind of political valence, and occasionally very kind of prominent SRC members kind of have a different effect. But there's no doubt that senior academics, when subject to proceedings, try and put their kind of thumb on the scales in all kinds of ways. We have tried to deal with this. So the Gender Equity Office at WITS, following the big scandal in 2012-13, stands apart from normal line manager authority. So it has a direct reporting line to the Vice Chancellor, and therefore you can't have a situation where deans and heads of school get to kind of sit on cases. It's kind of supposed to be outside, and then if there are cases involving senior management, it goes to council or an ombud. But without kind of divulging too much confidential information, it's really clear that key nodes within the universities, kind of powerful deans, are quite capable of kind of keeping cases out of GEO proceedings by threatening people who come forward. And the policy has been kind of written such that there's a whole bunch of obligations to train and obligations to report, but at no point has it ever been possible to get senior managements in a room to even give them a half-hour conversation on what the policy says and what their obligations are. And senior management at the university incredibly reluctant to say anything. They're not even prepared to give kind of boilerplate statements about how they have they're opposed to gender harm on campus. So I don't really know. Like there's also, and I think, Adrija, this gets to your point. You can use up so much energy and resources on cases that ends up being all these kinds of officers end up doing. They do disciplinary cases and counseling, and the proactive elements in terms of kind of try and persuade people to different forms of orientations, engagements about gender and different understandings of sexuality, all that stuff about kind of changing a deeply conservative cultural inheritance that students and staff come to in South Africa because that's the culture within which they're raised. None of that work gets done. So you know, as someone who has kind of skin in the game, and I have to kind of acknowledge my positionality, I've spent many years trying to make the system work, and I like to hope it works sometimes. I'm acutely aware that there's all kinds of backhanded processes where you can force people out, threaten them with retribution, get them to withdraw, and you know, we have provisions which get called special measures, where you can get senior managers of members of the university to try and create injunctions against people subject to proceedings interfering, but we all know they're going to, or at least they're going to think about it. And because they have friends and colleagues in high places, they don't often have to do it themselves. They can find end runs where sympathetic people in other parts of the university are quite capable of stepping on complaints. Like the hierarchies are strong, and it's very, very hard to get around them.
Over to you, Judith.
Yeah, I'm going to add that all of these things that you're talking about, Joel, are the things that prevent people from reporting in the first place. You know, the threats that, you know, I'm going to get you kicked off, or I'm going to spread your name around, or I mean, this is in the first place why people are being sexually abused for years and years and never do anything about it. But going to your point about, you know, the kind of cultural aspects of this and the kinds of ways that people grow up and how they think about gender and their own power and all the rest of it, you know, there's a lot of misconduct that many people, including the harmed person herself, does not feel rise to the level of something that I want to go to the university and complain about and go through this whole, I mean, everybody knows this, you know, in criminal law too. Even if the criminal system were, you know, completely friendly to survivors, which it's not, just to go through it again is, you know, onerous, and a lot of people don't want to do it. But furthermore, they feel like there are a lot of ambiguous situations. They're not really sure what it is, what to do about it. And that is a level at which we have a very thin, either institutional or cultural or political, you know, place to respond or to, you know, to work on. And again, to me, this is a political process. This is a community process, this cultural process. And, you know, I'm just reminded of Audre Lorde's quote that you cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And we need new tools that are not just, you know, more disciplinary boards. So much of, I can hear in Joel, so much of where these institutional responses come from is from grassroots demand. You know, it doesn't just come out of your head, it comes out of the feminist movement. And but I have watched in so many ways in the abortion rights movement, in many ways in which we professionalize our grassroots movements so that we lose track of what we want to do, and then we don't have power as grassroots activists. So I just again want to speak for the culture on the ground and having feminist institutions that are not part of the university, that are, you know, that are changing both women, men, and people of other genders who are, you know, engaged in these things.
Thank you so much, Judith. And I think this is a great point for us to kind of bring this discussion to a closure with Audre Lorde and thinking about grassroots feminist solidarity and movements. I want to thank you both for being so generous with your time and everything that you've shared with us today. You know, like both of you said, naming is happening in so many different ways. It's happening through online lists, it's happening through whisper networks, it's happening through communities of people supporting one another, and has always happened. Joel, thank you for sharing with us your work around a specific kind of institutional naming and the legalities around that, and sharing with us your experiences from wits and sitting in disciplinary boards and committees. Our audience have found this extremely helpful. But we've also started thinking about that, what happens once a person is named? How do we then ensure that the harm doesn't happen again, or they don't repeat the harm, and that they're integrated back within the community? And Judith, thank you for bringing in the transformative justice approach, which is not only about individuals. It is survivor-centered, but it is also not only about individual healing and relearning, but it is also about community relearning and community engagement. The question that I am going to kind of think about is like, how do we find reconciliation without truth? But also, like, when we think about accountability and justice, like carceral methods might not be able to achieve that. So how do we reimagining this? How do we learn from grassroots movements and thoughts and create new imaginations of ways of we can create cultural and structural changes? Thank you very, very much again, both of you. You've given us so much to think about. I have pages and pages of notes, and we will make sure that your points are reflected on in our report as well. A summary of everything that you have mentioned today will be available to our report and will be sent to everyone who joined us today. Thank you to all the people who have worked behind the scenes to make this happen. Erin, who's been working on our report and creating our literature review. Laura, who's been responsible for our media and communication. Jess, who's been monitoring the chat. Of course, big thank you to Anna for being so enthusiastic and supportive right from the beginning and co-creating this series with me. We are really looking forward to continuing this conversation on the 11th of March. So please sign up if you haven't. We will drop the link on the chat again in case you've missed it. Thank you very, very much again. Speakers, if you could please join us backstage. And to everyone in the audience, thank you and have a wonderful day and solidarity.